on time and give you as much time with the authors as possible. And we have a treat for you. We have not only one Steve, we have two Steves. Steve Harrigan and Steve Davis. I'm going to introduce Steve Davis, who's our moderator, and we really appreciate you coming out and doing this for us. So Steve, and my name is Karen, by the way. I work here with the festival and also at the library. Steve Davis is the curator for the Whitliff Collections in San Marcos at Texas State University. If you have not been to see it, you need to go right away. It's wonderful. He's also a very talented author. This book, hot off the press, has only been out a few days, from Texas A&M Press, The Essential J. Frank Dobie. We have some to sell at the bookshop tent all the way to the front. Also, Texas A&M Press is here, and I believe they'll have copies as well. Dallas, 1963, a wonderful book, very fascinating read. And then this just came out in paperback. It's a fairly new book, The Most Dangerous Man in America, about Timothy Leary. So without further ado, I know you're here to listen to these guys. I'm going to hand...
Thanks so much, Karen. Great to see you all here. And Steve and I are both very happy to be in Boerne. And look what I just picked up here, too. Wait. Isn't it gorgeous? It's a beautiful book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, so this interview with Steve will be conducted in ignorance, but I'm used to that, so that won't be a problem for me. And Steve Harrigan, as you must all know, is one of the great writers from Texas, not just today, but in the history of Texas. This is a gentleman who turned his back on a career as a freelance poet and instead decided to become a big-time wonderful writer. He's the most respected and probably beloved writer in Texas today. Many of you know he's written for Texas Monthly since the time Steve was mowing yards in Austin back in the early 70s. I think 6 novels, do I have that right? Yeah. Has everybody read Gates of the Alamo? Who's read that? Yeah. How about Remember Ben Clayton? That's got to be one of my favorite novels of Steve's, and several others. 5 nonfiction books, I think. You could say 6, since that might count as 2. Yeah, exactly. So many screenplays Steve's written. Some of those are a bit below the radar, but they're impressive productions, and you wrote a terrific essay. Is that in Eye of the Mammoth about being a screenwriter? Yeah, that's a nice book, too. Hopefully that's for sale here also. A collection of Steve's nonfiction writing. Steve has major awards from the Texas Institute of Letters, Western Writers of America. He's in the Texas Literary Hall of Fame. He has the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Texas Institute of Letters. He's just, as you all know, one of the wonderful writers from Texas. He's also, when I grew up, you think of writers. I grew up thinking of people like Bud Shrake and Larry L. King and Gary Cartwright as writers, and these were people who had very destructive personal lives, and or Hunter S. Thompson, people like that. And Steve really kind of broke that mold, and he is such, to people who know him. How many people here actually know Steve and have met him and talked to him? A few of you, yeah. There's a reason why all the other writers in Texas love Steve, and so many people do. He's always such a good mentor, always good with advice, always opening doors for people. And in that way, he's a lot like this guy, J. Frank Dobie. In any case, I just want to say, Steve, welcome to Boerne and to our book festival.
Thanks, Stephen. And hey, thank you. But before we go any farther, I really hope you guys will take a look and buy The Essential J. Frank Dobie, which I read very carefully and enthusiastically and endorsed on the back. And it's just a really, what Steve did with that book is he took the best of J. Frank Dobie, who's had a kind of, fragmented reputation over the years, and he really drilled down, found the very best writing of Dobie's and put it between two covers, and it's really it's a fascinating and enlightening book, and it's and also Dallas 1963, which you wrote with Bill Minutaglio, was really crucial to me when I was writing my history of Texas and getting into the Kennedy assassination. So those are and Timothy Leary. There's no more interesting character in American history probably. So anyway, thank you for agreeing to do this, and thank you, Karen, and everybody involved with the festival. This is a really cool festival. I'm really happy to be here.
Okay, so we'll get going. I think we have a little bit over an hour they gave us, so we're going to save time at the end for you guys to ask questions, and I'm just going to try to guide a bit of a conversation with Steve. I do want to say a big, wonderful thing. Those of you who haven't read it yet, including myself, the reviews have just been like, reviewers are doing cartwheels over this book. The starred review in Kirkus calls it as good a state history that has ever been written and a must-read for Texas aficionados. And then the rave from Publishers Weekly says, history lovers will enjoy this packed, fascinating account of a singular state. And then those of you who listen to NPR may have heard the review there recently, where the reviewer says, Harrigan essentially is to Texas literature what Willie Nelson is to Texas music. Is that true, Steve?
Well, let readers and listeners decide.
So, well, congratulations on the book. You worked on it for 6 years?
Yeah, about 6 years. You know, mostly off and on, but mostly on. You know, I would say 5.5 of those years were full bore working on the book.
Yeah, just tell us a little bit about how you came to do this.
Well, it wasn't my idea to write a history of Texas. I don't think any sane person would come up with that idea. It was Dave Hamrick at UT Press came to me and asked me if I'd be interested, and I said I don't think so. It felt like a lifetime project, and B, it felt like maybe it was better entrusted to a real historian rather than somebody like me who's a novelist and a journalist and a screenwriter. But he came back after I said no and just wanted to double check to see if I was still opposed to the idea. And by that time, it had started to get under my skin a little bit. I couldn't stop thinking about a project of this scale and scope. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, maybe I am sort of qualified to write it. I was proudly born in Oklahoma. Just let me get that off on the table. But we moved when I was 5 across the Red River to Abilene, and so I've lived here, 65 something years, and so I've seen a lot of Texas history firsthand unfold. I mean, not necessarily in the room where it happened, but I've been on the ground in Texas when a lot of things happened, and I've written a lot. I realized when I was thinking about doing this book, that almost every article I'd written over the last 40-something years for Texas Monthly had something to do with history in one way or another. And that's just how I'm geared. Everybody else at the magazine was writing about crime or business or sports. I was writing about little hidden corners of history. And then I'd written at least two historical novels set in Texas and done a huge amount of research for both of those. So it felt like, well, maybe I had earned the right to think of myself as capable of writing this book. And so I finally said yes and took a deep breath and began to write.
And it's interesting to hear you mention your journalism experience. I think one of the things you see with historical writing about Texas today, or really just in general, is that kind of fragmentation of interests where there's so many hyper specialists in sort of one area of history. Mm-hmm. And with your journalistic background, how did that work for you, taking on such a comprehensive subject?
Well, one of the things I realized about myself early on is that I was going into this without a thesis, without an agenda. I just wanted to write it as a story. And and we're talking about the whole history of Texas here, from 16,000 years ago, as I said last night, to like Rick Perry on Dancing with the Stars. So I mean, it's a big stretch of time, and but I realized that for me to be able to do it the way I felt was within my wheelhouse was not just to research this book, but to report it. So and that's where that journalism background comes in. Things come alive for me when I see them. And so I realized I'm going to need to get in my car. I'm going to need to go see all these places. I'm going to, have to let the sense of Texas, the sense of that history sort of soak in firsthand. So a lot of this book, was obviously reading and talking to people, but a whole lot of it was being on the road and going, for instance, to the confluence of the Rio Grande and the Pecos, and seeing the rock art, the pictographs that these ancient people had left there. Some of those, I'm sure some of you have been there to see in Seminole Canyon and places like that. Some of those pictographs are, 4,000 years old. That is about the same time the pharaohs were building their tombs in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. And we forget, or we never realize, how deep the history of Texas goes. And to stand there in front of those illustrations from so long ago, which are so mysterious and haunting, is it just makes your pulse race. I see something like that, and I want to get home as fast as I can and get to my computer and start writing about it. So basically, to answer your question, that journalistic background, which is a kind of deadline background, it's a kind of reporting background, and it's also a background of discovery. Of I wanted the reader to feel what I was feeling when I was discovering these things. And so I'm not, as I said in this interview lately, I'm not coming from a position of authority as a traditional historian would be. I'm coming from a position of discovery. And I don't know this stuff. I'm learning it on the go, and I'm hoping that the reader will sort of share my excitement about what I've seen and heard.
That sounds great. That kind of helps me understand why the reviews are so wonderful for this book, because I guess we're taking on that voyage of discovery with you as readers as you're doing that. So
yeah, that was priority number one with this book was to make it fun to read, to make it not like a standard history book.
And I've seen a couple of the excerpts that are in the current issue of Texas Monthly, which are quite extraordinary, and it looks like you're not trying to purposefully go in and deflate myths or anything. You may have some immunity to Texas nationalism by having been born in Oklahoma, perhaps. I will say, in that same regard, I was born in Kansas and was dragged here unwillingly at age 5. So, but in any case, since we're here in Boerne, can you just sort of tell us you guys know about the German Texans during the Civil War? Do y'all know that story? Who knows something of that story? Because I didn't learn anything about it in Texas history. We were never told. But can you go ahead and talk about that part of it?
Yeah, but I have a question first. Why is there a statue of Wild Bill Hickok? Does anybody know? I drove by and I thought it was is it George Kendall who is the head of Kendall? Maybe somebody like that. But no, it's Wild Bill Hickok. It's right up there. This part of Texas was a truly fascinating place during the Civil War and before. This part of Texas was settled largely by Germans who were brought here in several waves, and they came here. A lot of them were free thinkers. A lot of them very enlightened, sophisticated intellectual types. And there was this part of Texas, I think it was Gillespie County then. It may still have been Kendall County. I'm not sure, but it was like overwhelmingly voted against secession during the Civil War, and there were a lot of German-speaking people here who had good relations with the Comanches going back to John, I'll screw up his name, Musenbach, and they were not in favor of seceding from the Union. and that made them a target in some ways for the Confederacy, and they a group of them, and you know, Bryden, who I think is here, can tell us exactly how many were, but probably 60 or 70 people were trying to get to Mexico to avoid conscription in the Confederate Army, and they were caught up with on the Nueces and then later on the Rio Grande, and most of them were killed. And it's interesting, if many of you surely have been to Comfort, and you have seen the monument there on the side of the road. This actually limestone monument, which I said it was granite in the books. That's going to be changed in the second edition. But there's a limestone monument that, you know, the German phrase, again, pardon me I can't speak German, but True der Union, and it translates to true to the Union. And that's where the bones of these guys who were killed by the Confederate partisans were brought back and buried in Comfort. That is one of the only monuments to the Union on formerly Confederate soil in the whole Confederacy. So it's a very important place. This is a crucial part of Texas, and you know, the history here is very deep and very, very interesting.
Yeah, and you know, when you think about the history that so many of us learned was so black and white, and my wife and I are refugees from San Marcos, and we moved to New Braunfels with our kids when we got too old to be part of the party crowd, I guess. But you know, our youngest daughter went to a school down the street, which was called Carl Schurz Elementary. Does anybody know who Carl Schurz is or was? Well, one day I thought, well, I should look this guy up, and it turns out he was a close friend of Abraham Lincoln. He was one of the German free thinkers who came over as a revolutionary and fought in the Union side as a general and became, I think, a senator from Illinois or something like that. And he was, you know, as Yankee-loving could be. And I just thought to myself, I mean, the sort of the attitude of people in New Braunfels in 1925 to name their school after this great Union hero, you know, abolitionist, is really extraordinary. It makes you realize how the history of Texas that we have, that we've been taught or have absorbed, really is kind of limited. And I guess this is a big part, without, you know, getting in people's face about overturning previous conventions, but you're really trying to get into more of the, I guess, the layers of humanity in some respects.
Yeah, you know, people have asked me if this is like a revisionist history or some review called it a woke history, which is a little little dicey, but it's not. I mean, it is an attempt to tell the story as honestly as I could. And you know, I didn't have an agenda to correct the history we've been taught. I just had an agenda to write about things that interested me, and to make the book as comprehensive and as honest as I could make it. So you'll find in this book, for instance, there's a whole lot of women in this book, and you know, women were not written into Texas history for a long time, but I was very concerned about making sure that whenever I could find some woman to write about who had made an impact on Texas history, or maybe had not, but had just, you know, done something interesting.
Tell us about a couple of the women that you learned about and wrote about.
Well, I think my favorite woman in Texas history is a woman named Isabelle Talon. She was a French mother of 5 who came with La Salle in the 1680s to, you know, they were going to create a colony in the New World for France, and they overshot the Mississippi. They ended up planting their colony in this weedy little meadow above Matagorda Bay, and it was a total disaster. They were all basically wiped out by carancuas. The Spanish were desperate to find this. Texas was part of Spain back then, of course, and the Spanish were desperate to find what they called the French thorn, this French colony in Texas that they really needed to get rid of. So they sent expedition after expedition to find this rumored colony on the Texas coast. Finally, they found it, and this expedition under this guy named Alonso de Leon found the remains of the colony after it had been overrun. And one of the guys who was with De Leon was a poet, or was a writer, or a wannabe writer. His name was Juan Bautista Chapa, and he was. They came to this site of what was called Fort St. Louis, and it was just a mess. Everybody had died, pretty much. And they came across 3 skeletons. 2 of them were male. One of them was a woman with a tattered dress clinging to the skeleton. And historians are pretty sure that was Isabelle Talon, this woman who had come to France, to Texas from France. And this Juan Bautista Chapa sat down and wrote what may be the first poem ever written in Texas about her. And it was so. I kept thinking about her, what her life must have been like, what the terror she experienced. Her husband died, 2 of her children died, 3 of them were carried off by 2 were carried off by Caronquas. One was taken by LaSalle to be a translator with the Caddos. So she was left alone. The fort was overrun. She was killed. And after I had been to the site of Fort St. Louis, which is just this absolutely desolate, mosquito-ridden place, I went to the Victoria, to the Museum of the Coastal Bend, and they were showing me some of the artifacts that had been found from the fort. And I asked the guy, the curator, do you have anything that belonged to Isabelle Talon? And he said, well, come in the back with me, because it's not on exhibit. So we went into the back of the museum, and he took down what looked like a hat box, and he opened it up, and at first I couldn't understand what this was. I didn't know what it was. What I was looking at it looked like a rock, but it was their skull. And the skull had a dent in it from a Caronquois war club. And, I just kept staring at this thing. This is, this lonely woman who had voyaged all across the Atlantic, lost everything, but had been the inspiration for the first poem ever written about Texas. And there she was in this box in a museum, and it's just really, when you get that close to history, it's just so exciting, and you can't stop your imagination from running. So she was like only one of many women that I found really interesting and inspiring to write about.
Wow, that's an amazing story. And I guess, one of the other things I've heard about this book, which is really interesting to think about, is most of the other histories of Texas that we read sort of touch briefly on, I guess the prehistorical period before any writing, and then takes us pretty quickly through the Spanish and Mexican era, and of course is fixated on the 19th century and the great battles and wars and all that. But your book really gets into quite a bit of the 20th century. Is that?
Yeah, it's it's the whole history. So some of the 16,000 years of prehistory I kind of skipped over a little bit because there's not much to say. But yeah, if you open the book to the middle of the book, you'll probably come across Spindletop, which was 1901. And from the rest,
there it is.
Yeah. So from then on, it's the 20th century, or from say the Galveston flood in 1900, and that was one of the main drivers of doing this book was to like you say, most Texas history sort of either lose interest or run out of gas or just run out of pages after all the bloodletting of the 19th century. And you get a kind of sort of summary, but you don't really dig deep into the 20th century. But I found the 20th century to be absolutely riveting and exciting to write about. So, it was a real focus of mine to make sure that this book encompassed that.
So what kinds of 20th century things really transfixed you when you were working on this?
Well, starting with the Galveston flood in 1900, it was such a, still the worst natural disaster in American history. Either at least 6,000 people, maybe as many as 10,000 people died when a hurricane hit Galveston at that time. And when you talk about trying to make Texas history interesting. You look for the stories of the people who were caught up in these events. And my favorite guy in in the Galveston hurricane and flood was named Lloyd Failing. He was living in Galveston. I think he was a representative of a publishing company or something like that. And back in 1900, people didn't wear their bathing suits to the beach. They rented spaces in bathhouses and went down to change. And he was so proud of his multicolored bathing suit that he had just bought. He was really he was. Everybody was giving him compliments on it. He just loved it. So he was down there that afternoon when the hurricane hit, and this bathhouse, I can't remember the name of it. It's called the pagoda. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it was connected by a pier to the shore, and the waves were coming in, the wind was blowing, however 100 miles an hour, 150 miles an hour. The pier was breaking up, and it was like this disaster movie. He ran across this pier that was falling apart, jumping from plank to plank to save his bathing suit. And he barely got away with his life. And then, of course, in St. Mary's Orphanage, the most horrible story of all was there were all these orphans with these, and it was right on the shoreline, and the building was being destroyed, and the nuns decided the best thing to do was to tie ropes around. There were like I think 9 nuns, and they each had 10 orphan children tied to them by ropes, and hoping that they would survive the storm that way. And as the storm was tearing down the building, they were singing a hymn to the Virgin Mary called Queen of the Waves, which is a song asking for protection of the Virgin Mary against the torrents of the sea. And it unfortunately did not work. All those the people who were roped all drowned. There were like I think 7 or 8 kids who were not older kids who did not get roped, who survived. But it was just a horrific experience for everyone who experienced it. And again, that's the beginning of the 20th century. And when you think about what happened after that, the New London School explosion, where a school in East Texas blew up, killed 300 and something school children because of this natural gas leak. Bonnie and Clyde, the Kennedy assassination, Lyndon Johnson, just so many things that happened in the 20th century that are just endlessly fascinating to write about.
Let me ask this it's a slightly metaphysical question about the nature of writing history. I think we may have talked about this before, but it's interesting that, of course, to tell stories, it requires conflict, right, to make a story work. And so when we write history, we basically tend to focus on episodes of conflict, as a way to explain our past. But in another way, by focusing on that, it exaggerates the amount of conflict that we've had, rather than. And who wants to read a book about people getting along with each other, right? It's like watching 10 o'clock news and watching all happy neighbors helping each other trim tree branches or whatever. I mean, you can't do that, but you know how humans work together. So how did you try to achieve that balance to some degree?
Well, it is a fascinating metaphysical question. It's a good thing we're both philosophers, so we.
That's right.
There's the tenet that people are taught, people who want to be writers are taught, is that conflict equals drama and therefore equals reader interest. And that's true. I mean, it was really exciting to write about the Alamo or about the Indian Wars or about the Civil War. But one of the things I found was that it's interesting to write about the conflict that's within people. And, you take someone, like Catherine Ann Porter, the great Texas novelist, who, was wrestling with herself all her life and wrestling with the idea of Texas all her life, trying to get out of this state and yet desperately wanting to be recognized by it. In fact, when she lost the Texas Institute of Letters Award for Best Book to our friend J. Frank Dobie, I mean, that was like the last straw for her. There were, just the self-doubt that people like, say, Barbara Jordan had to wrestle with her whole life. Those are not obvious conflicts. They're not, wars, but they are struggles. And I do think, you can, I could have written this book about neighbors helping each other trim their lawns and stuff like that. But there is, even in a scene like that where you have two neighbors together, you can be sure that one of them has an interesting interior life. And I tried to, like John Conley, for instance, who famously, of course, survived the Kennedy assassination, barely. But when you look back at his life, his older brother, was a baby, rolled into the hearth and burned up at his family house. His daughter was probably murdered by an abusive boyfriend, or killed herself. They don't know exactly. When you look at what this guy had been through before he got into that car with Kennedy, it adds a kind of it adds a real depth of emotion and understanding, I think. And so I was constantly looking for those, for the backstories of these people that might not be as obvious or as written about, but are I think are really crucially important.
Very interesting. And people who know your writing know that you're really one of the leading writers in Texas of the environment. You've written a lot about the natural world for years and years and years. And how did you sort of work that interest of yours into this history of the state?
Well, I think it sort of just naturally seeped in for me. I mean, geology, geography, all that is destiny. And the interesting thing about Texas is it's, environmentalists call it a transition zone, where you have mountains, deserts, plains, prairies, forests, seacoast, all sort of converging in this gigantic place that is Texas. And I always pay great attention to where I am in terms of what the landscape is, what the scenery is, and what kind of plants and animals exist there. And I just think whether you're explicit about that when you're writing about a place or a time or not, if you're aware of that, if it interests you, I think that sort of, in an invisible way, sort of boosts the texture of the book. And and I would read John James Audubon came to Texas in 1836, and the guy was enchanted with what he saw in Galveston Bay. And he wrote this rhapsodic letter to his friends about the bird life and the life around the bay. And you read those things and you realize, yes, it was kind of a mosquito-ridden backwater, but it was also this glorious natural environment that, of course, has been debased over time, but it's still, you can find more than a few traces of how wonderful that this place must have been before say European contact or something.
Is that one of the stories that you cover in this book, is sort of the transition, I guess we could politely call it, in the environment in Texas over time?
Yeah, it wasn't like it wasn't an environmental screed. Look what we have done to the land. I didn't want to write that kind of book. I wanted to write a book about just about the history that had happened. But there have been a lot of technologies, extractive technologies, to use a current phrase, that have degraded the Texas landscape. There's been a lot of development. It's obvious to anybody who sees it, that this is not the place it once was. In many ways, it's better. In many, but in a natural sense, it's taken a big hit.
Okay, and I think we should talk about Steve Harrigan being the star of two recent books as well. Your friend Lawrence Wright, got interested in Texas kind of while you were working on this and did his own book. Is it God Save Texas?
Yeah, God Save Texas.
Who's read God Save Texas? Yeah, it's a terrific book. And do you remember how that book begins?
I do.
Tell us about that.
Well, Larry was asked. Larry is the New Yorker writer who wrote The Looming Tower, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and this fairly more recent book called Going Clear about Scientology. And David Remnick, his editor at the New Yorker, while I was working on this book, said to Larry, "Why don't you write about Texas?" And so Larry decided he would write a book about Texas. So I told Larry, we gotta, one thing we have to do, we're both writing books about Texas, let's get on our bicycles, and ride the Mission Trail in San Antonio, where you can go from there's a chain of 5 missions that ends up at the Alamo, and it's a wonderful thing to do if you've never done it. So Larry and I got on our bikes, and he begins the book with us driving to San Antonio, and we were on the way to San Antonio, and I said, Larry, you're writing about Texas. Here's a Buc-ee's up here. You really need to pull in. And Larry said, well, what's Buc-ee's? And I thought, oh man, you really need to pull in. So he begins the book pretty much at Buc-ee's, and and you can see his excitement at everything he sees there.
And the other book is Joe Nick Potowski, who will be here later today for a session. Published a book in last year. Has anybody read that book? It's called From Austin to ATX. It's a history of the geeks, slackers, visionaries, freaks, whatever, who made Austin Austin. And it's a really interesting cultural history of how these people who were very kind of nonconformist, independent-minded folks who settled in this very cheap place to live just pursued their own vision without really any idea of monetizing it, but somehow ended up creating, Whole Foods or Dell or, the Austin music scene and South by Southwest, the film industry, and of course the great number of writers that Austin's known for. And Joe Nick's chapter on print culture in Austin, on Austin's literary scene, begins with the image of a very young writer named Steve Harrigan in the early 1970s who's mowing a yard in Austin. And so why were you mowing yards, and what tell us a little bit about that?
Well, to make a living. I mean, it wasn't a hobby.
You weren't just helping somebody out there?
No, I mean, I had graduated from UT with a degree in English, so, I was mowing yards. And, but it was interesting, at that time in Austin, I had my rent originally, like when I was a student, was like $25 a month. But when I was living by myself, and I had to pay $400 a month for this garage apartment, and I owned I was making payments on a 1973 Toyota Corolla. I had bought a mower and an edger, and so I had about $200, in debt every month. And everything else was gravy that I made, beyond. Well, no, my rent was $100 a month. I'm sorry, my rent was $100 a month, and I was making like $200 a month profit mowing yards. And in Austin, that was, I was a rich guy, and I could sort of, write on the side, and it's the flushest I've ever been in my life. And now Austin is not quite as workable that way. I mean, if you're a one-man yard man company, it'd be really hard to make a living and own a car and have a mower and an edger like I did. But it was the town was wide open, for the kind of person I was trying to be, which was a writer.
So, and you basically finished work by noon or early afternoon and had the rest of the day to sort of write or do whatever?
Yeah, I started, I probably started, in the cool of the day, if to whatever degree there was cool in the day in August in Austin, and it started about 6:30, and I'd be through by about 2, and then I could take a shower and work, and it was great.
Okay, and we'll get back to your book, but I just want to ask you a question about my book, and actually it's J. Frank Dobie's book. To be honest, this is Dobie was a incredible writer and overlooked to some degree, but you're one of the people who sort of benefited from Dobie's, I guess, his legacy. You were one of the writers at the Dobie Paisano. Is that right? Yeah. Can you just talk a little bit about that, and maybe a little bit about Dobie too, if you don't mind?
Yeah, J. Frank Dobie. Well, you've written a whole biography of him, so but you know far better, more than I do. But J. Frank Dobie was a really important, not just writer, but intellectual presence in Texas back in from the 30s to the early 60s, I guess, right? And he was kind of the conscience of Texas in a way, a kind of intellectual, rustic intellectual voice that people paid attention to. And one of the things he did was, when he died, they bequeathed his ranch to the Texas Institute of Letters and the University of Texas as a writing retreat, basically. And back in the 1977, after applying for this fellowship 3 times, I finally got it, and it was 6 months on J. Frank Dobie's 256-acre ranch, I think, out on the outskirts of Austin. And it was just me and Sue Ellen and our 1-year-old daughter Marjorie, and we had 6 months to be on this ranch, and I wrote a whole book there. It was
Aransas?
Aransas, yeah, my first novel, and that was so important to me in terms of giving me a jump start in my career, making it possible. I don't know that I could have been a writer without that kind of support. And I could, after that, I didn't have to mow as many yards.
And I just want to mention we have some of the Dobie family here. We have Dudley Dobie,
that's right,
Seiza Dobie, Marcel Dobie Smith, and I think Cheryl Smith Rogers is here as well.
Wow.
Thank you for coming today. And so, let's see. We still have several minutes left for the session, and we'll get to the questions in just a couple of minutes. But I just want to get back to your book and ask you a couple of other things. It's impossible to avoid the reality of the historical outrages perpetrated by Anglo-Americans in Texas over time. Particularly violent in the 19th century and through other extra legal means in the 20th century. Tell me about your approach to interpreting the history, say, of African Americans and Mexican Americans in telling this story.
Well, the approach was just to include it, and to not look at the story of Texas as it's been looked at in the past as a kind of settled thing. One of the interesting things I did, I really had fun writing about the Texas Centennial in 1936, which was the birthday party that Texas threw for itself on the 100th anniversary of its independence from Mexico. And if you've ever been to Fair Park in Dallas, you still see those buildings, including the Hall of State, which is still in operation, that were part of this, essentially a World's Fair of Texas history. And that the really interesting thing about it was Texas at that time had sort of decided, okay, history is done. Meaning Anglo-Texans had won. Texas was an Anglo place, and there were all these pageants about Spanish. There was a place called the Cavalcade of Texas, a big show that was an outdoor show where they had this huge pageant of Texas history, and they had Mexican armies and Indians and black people and Spanish explorers. They were all played by white people. Some of them were sprayed to be a darker shade. But you look at that and you think, well, we've come a long way. Texas has come a long way. We have to understand that this story is not a binary story of victors versus defeated. It's the story of all these kinds of people who come together, mixed together, created a culture that is still evolving, still very complex. And in particular with Mexican Americans or Tejanos or Latinos, whatever you want to say, our border with Mexico is probably the defining thing in Texas history. It has, there's so much conflict and creative fermentation that takes place along that border that continues obviously today. And, in terms of African Americans, it's been a long, hard road. But you look at people like George Ruby and Matthew Gaines, who were, or later on, Barbara Jordan, who had a tremendous role to play in the political history of Texas. You have people like Bessie Coleman, who was one of the first women pilots, and the first woman African American pilot, who inspired generations of girls. There are just so many people who are Texans, who are not Texans, by accident, who have created, who are brought here, who were enslaved, who themselves or whose descendants, became, vital parts of Texas history. So, again and again, I would be writing about some African American person and realize, well, they were born to a sharecropper, and that sharecropper was born to a slave and was freed, at the end of the Civil War during Juneteenth. So, it's just a tapestry. It's just like this incredibly complex and intricate story of so many different kinds of people.
And with all this research and thinking and writing you've been doing about Texas and all the stories that make up this place, what do you see just kind of peering around the corner for Texas to come?
It's I don't know how to. I've been working real hard at portraying the past, and people keep asking me to predict the future, and it's really, I don't know. I do feel, I'm Texas. If you look at the map of the United States, it's real interesting because it all funnels down to Texas. Texas is this gigantic, thing on the map it sort of sits at the center, at the bottom of the United States. It's kind of the ballast of the whole continent, or at least the whole country. And this huge long border with Mexico. And you can't imagine thinking about this place ever being inconsequential. Economically, culturally, it's a laboratory for everything that's happening in the United States. We're looking at immigration now. We're more looking at. There's a tremendous struggle about what to do about immigration. It's the same problem that Mexico had in the 1830s. What to do about all this illegal immigration from the United States? It's just flipped on its head, but it's still there. It's still, as intractable and as intractable a problem and an exciting a prospect as ever. You look at something like abortion. That, Roe v. Wade in 1973 was that's the marker that was set down on abortion, and we're still wrangling about that today. And economically, you look at go to Sweetwater or and drive along the highway there, and all you can see are windmills. There's the ship channel, which is nothing but extractive technology and pipelines and fracking towers, not fracking towers, but cracking towers. And then you go to out on the high plains or out on over by Sweetwater in that area, and you see the future in terms of wind technology, and that's the biggest wind farm in the country. And so, Texas is leading the way for in almost every indicator of what's going on, and, not to mention high tech and all that. but it's also interesting to me. Texas is still its own thing. It's not just a the second largest state in the country. It's the most the state that's most devoted to having an image of itself. And I think that that people, no matter if you got here 10 minutes ago, no matter if you're here from from Pakistan or Malaysia, you go to Buc-ee's and you think, this looks interesting. Maybe I want to be a Texan, and so that I think that identity is being diffused by the kinds of people who are changing Texas, but it's also it's also solidifying. I think everybody wants a piece of it. Texas is a thing that seems to have a kind of a viable identity that other states may be envying.
Great. Let's open up this conversation if we can. Who's got some questions or comments for Steve? We have 20 minutes left, so please. That'd be good.
I have a comment, and I'll use last names since we have two Steves here. Mr. Davis, you mentioned that there has been a comparison of Mr. Harrigan with Willie Nelson, and there's a certain irony about that because Mr. Harrigan was a co-founder and one of the moving forces in creating Capital Area Statues Inc. in Austin. And the third statuary that they erected to great fanfare was of Willie Nelson in downtown Austin. I would bet that if you asked Willie Nelson what their next statue should be, he would say it should be Steve Harrigan.
I've proposed that, but the committee turned it down. By the way, Dudley and Say's Adobe are donors to our statue committee, and it is we put up 3 statues so far in Austin. One of J. Frank Dobie, Roy Bedichek, and Walter Prescott Webb at Barton Springs. One of Angelina Eberly, who we haven't talked about, who was the patron saint to guys like you, archivists, who shot off a cannon to keep the archives from being stolen from Austin and moved to Houston in 1842, and hence saving Austin as the capital city of Texas. And then we did Willie Nelson, which we coincidentally unveiled on April 20th. And I was telling my kids, Willie's gonna be there, and we're gonna unveil this statue on April 20th. And they looked at me and said, "Dad, you know what 420 is?" I said, "No, what is it?" And it's national. Is it national?
Willie picked the date?
It was the only date he had free, but it's like it's National Marijuana Day.
That would be his busiest.
And the only time he had free was at 4:20 in the afternoon. So we had this big unveiling in downtown Austin, and you could detect a certain scintilla of marijuana in the air.
By the way, when his bus rolled up to that and the door opened, there was a
Yeah, right. Big contact high for everybody.
Other questions and comments? Yes. Yeah, did everybody hear that question? After my book came out, there were a few books that were published that I wished I had had a chance to read, because they really shed a lot of light. I did read Andrew Torget's book, Seeds of Empire, but I wish I had read it more closely than I did, because I think it's an extremely important book about
the role that cotton played in the founding of Texas, or of Anglo-Texas, and in the Texas Republic. And it really just lays it all out, that had it not been for cotton was the driving force of everything. The other book that I didn't have a chance to even look at before mine came out was a book called The Injustice Never Leaves You by Monica Munoz Martinez. And it's a look at the violence that happened along the Rio Grande border during the time of the Mexican Revolution, from 1910 to 1920, basically. And she focuses on two separate incidents. One was the massacre at this little town called Porvenir, where a bunch of Texas Rangers and other people came and just basically cold-bloodedly killed 15 villagers in reprisal for a raid that had happened, but these people were probably not involved. And the other incident was, which I write about in my book, were these two guys in Hidalgo County named Jesus Bazan and Antonio Longoria, who were basically assassinated by the Rangers. And those were just incidents that illuminated how utterly violent and lawless the Rio Grande border was, particularly at that time. I'm sorry, on the prehistory, is that what you said? Yeah. Well, I said I didn't spend a lot of pages on the prehistory because there's just, there wasn't, all that much to write about. But when I say that, I want to make sure that people understand how haunted I am by the prehistory of Texas. I have read about the Galt site. I've yet to be able to go there, but this is a very important place near Salado, where an archaeologist named Michael Collins and others have discovered that the life in Texas went back before what was known as Clovis, which was there's certain kind of spear point arrowheads, they're called Clovis, that were found originally in Clovis, New Mexico. And it was thought at one time that people had lived in Texas for only like 10,000 years. But the discoveries at the Galt site and other places like that take it back to probably 16,000 years. And there are, the book begins after a certain prologue. I go to the Alley Bates flint quarries up near Amarillo and on the Canadian River, which is the site of Texas's first business, where people were mining flint and trading it all across the Southwest and the rest of the continent. And then I went down and I write about of course the pictographs in the Rio Grande. And though I make the point in the book that this is 15, 16,000 years of history. I can't portray it. But I can't remember how many generations I figured out. Hundreds and hundreds of generations of people who lived here before recorded history began in 1528, for whom we have not a single name, the name of a tribe or a nation, but those people were just as alive and just as full of energy and excitement and thoughts and ideas as we are. And I would love sometime to be able to write a book about prehistory, because it is, but we don't have, unlike say the Egyptians, we don't have hieroglyphs, we don't have anything to read that gives us an indication of what we just have these enticing, intoxicating images that have been Carolyn Boyd and others have sort of interpreted these pictographs on the Rio Grande as a kind of very similar to what the Egyptians were doing in terms of the soul's journey after death, and it also has something to do, they think, with the peyote cult in northern Mexico, and so it's a very it's scant in terms of what I could do with it, but it's deep in terms of how much I thought about it and how excited I was to learn about it. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
It must have hurt what you had to leave out. I mean, there's so much there, and trying to decide what to go in there and what you had to leave out.
Yeah. The question was, it must have hurt to realize how much I had to leave out, even though I have almost 1,000 pages. I keep finding things I left out, and I'm kicking myself. But I don't think I'm going to do a second edition because I'm tired, for one thing, and because it's just, I had to make judgments all the way through, and like I would be going along, and I thought, how much do I really have to write about Governor Oscar Colquitt? Probably a great guy, probably really important, but it didn't. Yeah, I couldn't do every governor that had ever been, or every senator. I just had to kind of make judgments about who was crucial, who was kind of either crucial in terms of the history, or in terms of my interest in them and being fun to write about. So there's lots of people in this book who are maybe not that important in terms of the course of Texas history, but I just couldn't resist writing about them. So it was real judgment calls all the way through, and there's a lot I could have written. I wish I had the time to write about the role, for instance, that Texas played in the American Revolution. It wasn't huge, but it was significant. But I just didn't. I just had to move on, And so yeah, I'm. Every time you write a book, you put it on your bookshelf and you think that's done, and then you start thinking about how you could have done it better, what you could have put in it, what you could have left out. And I'm going through that, process right now.
In terms of the judgments that you had to make, you had me from the beginning, starting with big text. What influenced that decision to begin?
Okay. The question is, what influenced me starting the book with big text? I was looking for a way into this book that felt different, that felt inviting, that sort of signaled that this book has an eye out for the contemporary Texas, not just past Texas. And I kept thinking, how can I begin this book? I didn't want to begin it with bacteria or lava, and I didn't want to the formation of the earth. That just sounded like, okay, you would skip over that stuff. So I thought I'll start it with big Tex burning down at the Texas State Fair, and for one thing, it's a very vivid image. It's a horrifying image. Everybody knows who Big Tex is, right? The giant cowboy statue at the Texas State Fair. It's been there since, I think, 1952. And he caught on fire in 2012, I think. And they're all over the state or all over the country. There were these images of this cowboy in flames. And somehow that seemed important. I don't know why. But it gave me a chance to and that took place at the fairgrounds in Dallas. It gave me a chance to sort of flash back from there to that 1936 centennial I was talking about, and how that had sort of codified the idea of what Texas was. But in fact, that is almost 100 years ago now. And so I just wanted to make the reader experience something fun at the beginning rather than something just dutiful. So that was how thank you.
Who else? Otherwise, I'm going to spend the rest of our time talking about J. Frank Dobie's.
Let's talk about J. Frank Dobie. Tell me about why did you decide to write or to edit and write the essential J. Frank Dobie?
Well, thanks for asking, Steve. As Steve mentioned, I'd written a biography of Dobie earlier, about 10 years ago, and it was because when I was in graduate school, Dobie, had been one of the most prominent and controversial Texans of his time. He was born at the tail end of the great cattle drives, and he basically invented Texas literature because after World War I, he was teaching British literature at UT Austin. And, the idea of American literature then was very radical. And as far as Texas went, well, reading and writing came late to Texas. So, so W was busy teaching these young Texans all about the elements of British literature, all the great writers. And at the same time, he knew that Texas was a place that had all of this great oral culture, all these wonderful folk tales and stories. He said that there were, stories of the coyotes that rivaled anything the Brothers Grimm had done. There were stories of ghosts out in the brush country that were as real as Hamlet's father. And all these people who knew these stories were all dying out. So Dobie made it his mission to go out and collect those stories. And his belief was the story belongs to whoever tells it best. So he was not a literal scientific folklorist, but he adapted these into his books, inventing Texas literature and becoming a huge cultural hero, because it was around the time of the centennial when he really rose to prominence and he gave Texans something to be proud of. We finally had a writer we could call our own. And so, but by the time I came along, Dobie had been attacked by generations of critics, beginning with Larry McMurtry, who attacked him soon after his death. Dobie died in 1964. And, and I love Catherine Ann Porter. Her Pale Horse, Pale Rider might be the best piece of writing, certainly one of the best pieces of writing ever done about Texas. But people are still pissed off that she didn't win that award over Dobie, and they have blamed Dobie for it. So Dobie was seen as a misogynist, he was seen as a racist, he was seen as a terrible writer. And at my day job at the Woodruff Collections, I was asked to do an exhibit on Dobie. And I just thought, oh, shit, okay. I mean, this old racist honky who was a misogynist too. And of course, what I found immediately was that Dobie had been wildly misunderstood. This is a guy who integrated the Texas Folklore Society in the 1920s. He brought in a young Mexican-American woman who became president of the Folklore Society in 1930. And when you think of the history of Texas, the fact that this major intellectual organization in the state was run by this Mexican-American woman, a female. And then in 1934, he brought in the first African-American member of the Folklore Society. Dobie was teaching at UT, and he got fired essentially because he was calling for the complete integration of UT Austin in the 1940s. And he was the first Texan to come out against McCarthyism. He opened doors for so many other writers, men, women, various ethnicities. And I just saw Dobie as somebody who was really a hero and had not gotten his due. So I decided to write this biography of him to sort of help set the record straight. And it was so much fun to do. One thing I didn't do, though, is I didn't really get into a reappraisal of his writing as literature. I just sort of focused on him as a person. And so after the biography came out, there's been kind of this quiet Dobie renaissance taking place in Texas. And one of the places you see it crystallized is in this old ghost town halfway between San Antonio and Corpus Christi called Oakville, population 32. Steve and I have both been there. It's a festival called Dobie Dichos, and Dudley has been there as well, Dudley Dobie. And the creator of this festival decided to really invite a lot of the leading writers and storytellers in Texas to come every year. I think it's November 1st or 2nd this year, the first Friday in November, and to share stories of Dobie. And I was invited, and I went, and I just thought, who's going to be there? And there were about 200 people there who all brought their own lawn chairs. And when I heard Dobie's words spoken out loud, it's really the way they were meant to be heard, and I was just surprised at how good they sounded. I mean, I always knew that Dobie was capable of writing really good things. He has so many great quotes. One is, the average PhD thesis is nothing but the transference of bones from one graveyard to another. He's just had a way with words. But hearing his words spoken live, and then that really turned my head and got me thinking that Dobie was that, like you said, you think later about, well, what did I miss with this book I published? I missed the fact that Dobie was a better writer, and I gave him credit for it. But also in my day job, and this is the second part of my story, which I'm winding up, I promise, before we run out of time, is I was doing an exhibition on Cormac McCarthy, one of the great writers in the world. And I saw in there that Cormac McCarthy had borrowed very, very, very closely, nearly word for word, some of Dobie's earlier writing. And I thought to myself, why would one of the world's greatest writers feel compelled to basically steal from somebody who had been denigrated as barely a writer at all? And when I realized that Dobie actually could often be quite a brilliant writer. He just needed a little editorial help to sort of prune back. He loved to sort of wander and digress because he had all the time in the world, as did his listeners, to hear these stories. And so that basically set me off to really, as Steve mentioned, to go find his best writing. Dobie had great adventures. He toured. He was in post-war Germany. He was in England during World War II. He visited Dachau. He was at the Nuremberg trials. He went behind Soviet lines to tour Hitler's chancellery before it was demolished. Dobie was always on the edge of intellectual freedom and human rights. And he also is the guy who, rode by mule for months through Mexico looking for the greatest lost mine in North American history and finding it finally with a guy who'd been searching for it almost his whole life. And as Dobie would say, the real treasure wasn't finding the lost mine, it was the stories and the people you meet along the way. And so that's basically what this book is about.
Somebody asked me earlier what books did you regret not being able to read before mine came out, and this is one, The Essential J. Frank Dobie, because one of the things I tried to keep track of in my book is the intellectual history of Texas, and I didn't take Dobie seriously enough until I read Steve's book. And you think about people like Swante Palm, who endowed the UT library, basically UT University of Texas Library, with his own personal library, or people like Stanley Marcus, who created Neiman Marcus, or Catherine M. Porter. Well, J. Frank Dobie belongs in the intellectual history of Texas, front and center. And that book is a total revelation to me.
I told my wife it's the best book I ever wrote, which is Dobie's writing. He's a great writer. So, it's talk about wonderful bookends. There you go.
And one would take less time to read.
This will be a cornerstone for a long time to come.
Yeah, you can build a whole wall with it.
Well, thanks everybody. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
I forgot a few things before you head out. I neglected to mention our wonderful sponsor. We couldn't be here without our sponsors. And the sponsor of this panel is Miss Peggy Bowie, back there, and Lone Star Realty. And I'd like to also thank the Kendall County Historical Commission for coming out today, too. Like I said before, Steve's books are going to be up in the book tent, and they'll be signing up there, too. And we have Steve Harrigan's books. In addition to these two that are on the table, we have the novel, The Gates of the Alamo, a bestseller, and also A Friend of Mr. Lincoln. And they're really good. And I wanted to mention UT Press also has the books, and they're on the way. And please stop by and meet the UT Press people, because they're a big part of why we were able to get Steve Harrigan here today. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you at the signing area at the very front of Main Plaza.